we are very grateful to our today's speaker, Professor Helen Milner, who kindly accepted to participate to this event. Helen Milner is the Bertie Charles Forbes, the Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University and the Director of the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. She is currently President of the International Studies Association for the 2021 term, as well as a member of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Her research interests include international and comparative political economy, the connections between domestic politics and foreign policy, globalization and regionalism, and the relationship between democracy and trade policy. Another stream of a recent research deals with American foreign policy, and in particular, she investigates the sources of public and elite preferences for international engagement and the role of the president versus Congress in setting foreign policy. Most recent projects focus on issues related to globalization and development, such as the political economy of foreign aid, the digital divide and the global diffusion of the internet, and the relationship between globalization, democracy, and populism. Her research in these areas considers in particular African countries, for example, Uganda, Ghana, and Tunisia. Among others, she has published in the top journals in political science, such as the American Journal of Political Science, the Annual Review of Political Science, and International Organization. She is also the author of several books, and in particular, her book, Sailing the Water's Edge, Domestic Politics and American Foreign Policy, co-authored with Dustin Tingley, which was published for Princeton University Press in 2015, won the 2016 Gladys Kammerer Award for the best book published in the field of US national policy. Without further ado, let me say it's very nice to have you here, Helen, and I will now leave the screen for you. You will have about 45 minutes, and after that, there will be 15 minutes for Q&A. As a reminder, I kindly ask you to write your question in the Q&A session or to raise your virtual hand if you would like to ask the question in person. Please do not use the chat. Please mute your microphone and disable your video for better connectivity. Only unmute your microphone to ask a question and mute it back after the exchange is completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia, for such a nice introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Claudio and Lucia and Jean Egbert for inviting me. I'm really sorry I can't be in Milan. That would be wonderful, but I do appreciate you all attending this keynote talk. So let me get started without further ado. Why didn't that work? What I want to talk to you about today is globalization, democracy, and populism. And my work really starts from the question of what are the political consequences of globalization. And what we've seen recently is that there's been a lot of political turbulence, and I think all of you living in Europe have gotten a good dose of this, as well as us in the United States. Democracies, especially liberal democracies, are facing very serious challenges, both from within and from without. There's been a decline in the number of democracies globally since 2014. There's been a decline in global freedom as Freedom House ranks things, and there's been a rise in the share of populist votes on the far right, especially across the world, but in particular in Europe. And my question really is globalization part of the cause of these political problems? This is just a graph from 1970 onward showing you in parliamentary elections in the 15 Western European countries, what's been happening in terms of parties coded as center right, center left, populist right, and populist left. And what you can see is that the center left has had a very difficult time lately, while the populist right has been gaining, and the two of them are getting actually very close in terms of vote shares. And this is part of the issue with this political turbulence. If you look at the world and global populist vote shares, what you again see is that these vote shares have been rising over time, and that it is the right, the far right populist vote shares that have been rising the most. So the question I ask is really, what is the relationship between democracy, especially liberal democracy, and global capitalism? And by global capitalism, I really mean globalization, where you have this extensive international market in goods and services and capital and labor that links all these economies across the globe, and that where each economy is very tightly linked to other economies, as well as to kind of the entire global market. And from Karl Marx onward, this has been a really critical issue, and parties on the left and the right have taken different stances on this, whether democracy and capitalism are compatible with one another. And this is I think the question that has been on a lot of people's minds lately. So what I want to talk about today, in part, is three kind of mechanisms by which globalization may undermine democracy. Often inadvertently, by creating greater economic inequality, by generating more individual insecurity in people across the world, and by connecting states even further to generate greater interdependence at a global level, where at a national level you have democracy, and so you've got this tension between the international and the domestic. So part of the issue that I'm interested in is kind of, how did capitalism go global? And have we had occurrences of this in the past? And if you look through history, what you'll notice is that this is really the second period of enormous globalization. This period, I think, from the 1980s, from 1990 roughly on, you've seen trade flows and capital flows and flows of people all reach highs globally. And it looks like that around 2010, right after the financial crisis, seems to be the high point here. This globalization process has been accelerated by kind of another technological revolution, the digital revolution. And it's been sort of pushed forward by American hegemony in the international system and American foreign policy. All of this has a lot of similarity in general, not in the particular circumstances, with the first period of globalization, which was in the late 19th century up to World War I. So the first industrial revolution is around the turn of the 18th century. It's followed by a period of British hegemony, in which the British, along with other European countries, opened markets all over the world. The problem with this period is that while it's a very dynamic period from about 1850 to 1910, it encompasses the second industrial revolution with electricity and electrification. It then runs into the period of 1910 to about 1945 with the World Wars, the Great Depression. And in this period, all of that globalization is basically reversed. And a lot of the democracies that sprouted, even if they were imperfect democracies at the time that sprouted, they often turned to be non-democratic regimes. You get a lot of protectionism, nationalism, and fascism. And the wars and the economic depression basically end globalization, and they roll back democracy. And the concern is, are we going to see this again? So this is from about 1800 to 2010. It's a look at world exports as a percentage of world GDP. And what you'll see here is that there's this peak, this first period of globalization from about 1850 to 1910, followed by a return to, much lower globalization, and then the taking off of globalization again after about 1950. And in about the 1990s, you reach the pinnacle that you had back in 1910, but then you go on upwards. This is the Globalization Index put together by the ETH group, very useful index. And what you can see here is a shorter period where globalization really accelerates from 1990 to about 2008 or 9. The financial crisis, then after that, things flatten out. And we may see either flattening or a downturn or upward movement. It's really unclear what's going to happen at this point. This is just to show you what's happening in terms of trade. The point I want to make about globalization is that while capital flows and labor flows and foreign investment and things like that are important, they're dominated by trade. Trade is a much larger percentage of GDP for almost all of these countries than is migration or capital flows. And you're going to see that in some of the other work that I present. So how did capitalism go global? And I think here we have to understand that it was not some inevitable thing. It was policy choices that really mattered. Starting in the 1980s, the advanced industrial democracies, especially led by the United States and Germany, start opening up their capital markets and their trade even more. And then we see the opening in China after 1979. With the end of the Cold War, we see the opening up of Russia and Eastern Europe. And finally, from about the early 1990s onward, the developing countries begin to liberalize as democracy spreads. We've also got the technological revolution, the digital revolution that starts driving even greater trade, the global trading networks. And again, you've got American hegemony pushing all of this forward as you did in this earlier period. Both of these periods seem to face similar problems, and that's rising economic inequality. If you think back to the late 19th century, this is the period of very, very high inequality in the United States and in many Western European countries. That inequality is reversed. Probably the only good thing about the interwar period is that it reverses a lot of this inequality, but at a very, very high cost, obviously. And you see this technological change in both periods, massive technological change. In fact, some economists believe that the biggest period of technological change we've ever seen is from about 1870 to 1910 and not now. But again, you see the kind of insecurity that goes along with this technological change, as well as the growing interdependence among countries and governance problems associated with this, the failure of the League of Nations in that earlier period, the difficulties that we're having now with things like the EU and Brexit. And the question is, are these kind of processes and mechanisms going to again stop globalization and hurt democracy? Will we see the same pattern that we saw earlier? So what I want to look at again are the political consequences of globalization. And as I said, there's been just a lot of political theory, economic theory about the relationship between the two of them. There's this question of whether capitalism is necessary for democracy. Can you really have democracy if you don't have private property? If the state owns everything, will people have any freedom? On the other hand, does capitalism, through a variety of mechanisms of creating assets and income in a wealthy group, does that undermine democracy? And in general, there have been real concerns about the distributive consequences of capitalism. And in this earlier period from about 1950 onward, what happened was the political response to globalization was embedded liberalism, which was to build up a welfare state and social welfare policy to kind of surround global capitalism with more constraints on it so that it wasn't quite as turbulent. In the policy response from the 1980s on, as I've shown, has been to basically relieve all of those constraints and let globalization go and let it flow. And the welfare state has not really kept up with the increased levels of globalization we've seen. So the question I ask really, and that I want to talk about a little bit is globalization causing publics to turn to the extreme right and to turn away from center parties on the left and the right? And is social welfare spending able to moderate the impact of globalization any longer? It seemed to work from the 1950s to about 1990, but now we're concerned that it may not be working anymore. So the question is really, what would generate support for the extreme right? We would think that if workers are hurt by globalization, that they would turn to the left and the solutions that the left proposes, which are often to rein in capitalism. But that's not what's been happening. What we've seen is voters turn to the far right and not to the far left. So the story I want to tell a little bit is that, global capitalism creates losses in the advanced industrial countries, as we know from trade theory, with often lower wages, unemployment, and more insecurity for lower skilled workers. These lower skilled workers tend to be the median voters in a lot of advanced industrial countries. These losses then are associated with increased inequality. They generate insecurity and greater anxiety. And oftentimes what we see is this leads to psychological pressures for more authoritarian solutions against international connections and ties and things like immigration and trade and foreign investment, as well as rising nationalism that goes in this whole bundle. And what we've seen is that the extreme right parties have responded to this by developing programs that emphasize ways in which you can alleviate this insecurity and kind of contribute to these psychological needs. And that is emphasizing things like protectionism, nationalism, nativism, distrust of elites, kind of more authoritarian types of solutions, and anti-liberalism. And again, for many of you, what's happening in the Eastern European countries is kind of this illiberal democracy that focuses on some of these more authoritarian forms of democracy. And so rising globalization, I think in these ways can generate support for the extreme right. What I look at in some work I've done is all the kind of various elements of globalization. I just want to show you very briefly some of the empirical work. So I look at trade, foreign investment, immigration, finance, as well as technology. And I really believe that technology is part of globalization. It's not completely associated with globalization, but we certainly think that globalization accelerates technological change, spreads it much more rapidly and much more quickly. And so I think that a lot of the tension around globalization is related to technology, and I'll show you that in some of the work. I also think it's important to remember that the financial crisis, which starts in the United States, then spills over everywhere because of the integrated financial markets that we have now, which again are parts of globalization. The other thing I'm going to look at a little bit is inequality, and I'm not going to talk about it here, but I'm doing some work on social welfare spending and the whole embedded liberalism question. And what I want to do is to look at the regional level here. We know that these processes and globalization are affecting countries at regional levels and at much smaller levels than the country. So I think it's important to look at disaggregated data. And obviously, we'd like to get down to the individual level to be able to do this, because then we have much closer causal identification. But what I'm going to do here is look at much more fine-grained data at the individual level within these 15 European democracies from 1990 to 2018, and at this regional level. And so I create this globalization shock variables that come off of the Otter, Dorn, and Hansen work and the Colantoney and Stanig work, where you're taking the national level data, you're using the local level data on industry labor usage, and you're translating basically the variables of imports, foreign investment, as well as technology through the use of robots into regional level effects through these labor markets. And what I want to do is use 3-year differences to kind of match the average time between elections, with the base being 1992 in effect at the beginning of the sample, so that you're dealing with some of the endogeneity. I'm going to also look at the US level data here as Otterborn and as Colantoney and Standing do as an instrument to get away from some of the endogeneity. I'll also use an immigrant shock variable, which is the stock of nationals, again, pegged to 1992. And I'm going to look at inequality through a coefficient of variation that we got by looking at the average income and standard deviation of income by region. Again, so it's a much finer level of data. And what you see here is these are the kind of regression results for the OLS and the 2-stage using that instrument. What you see here is this trade shock is driving support for the right populist parties. It's not having that much of an effect on the other groups of parties, center right, center left, and left populist. But it does seem to have an effect in pushing people into this right populist. Foreign investment and immigration don't seem to have much effect, interestingly. And this is true through a variety of regressions and robustness. Inequality doesn't seem to be driving it either. There are obvious issues here with trade affecting inequality and inequality affecting other things. So I have to be a little bit careful about that. The other big factor here is the financial crisis. It's very clear that the financial crisis hurts the left for some reason. And it's very clear that the financial crisis helps the right populist parties. And if you do an interaction again with the trade shock and the financial crisis, what you see is, again, it's hurting, especially the center left, but it's hurting all of these parties. It's kind of helping, and in other regressions I get that there's a very strong effect on the populist right. But you'll see that that effect of after this financial crisis, the trade shocks have a big impact. Technology in the form of this routine task intensity, where jobs that are ripe for offshoring and for robots tend to, again, drive support for the right and hurt all the other parties. So what I would just say is that trade is having a big impact on support for populist right parties. Immigration and foreign investment don't seem to have much effect. Technology seems to be important, but it's reducing support for the center and the far left. The global financial crisis seems to be an important driver of these things. Colantoney and Standing, again, have done some of this work, and Otterborn and Hansen in the United States. The difference here is really that they stop in 2007, so they don't pick up any of the financial crisis. They also don't look at technology. So in a sense, I'm updating and pushing forward on what they're doing. And as I said, this data is pretty robust to all sorts of different ways of kind of doing things and looking at things. And I would say there is sort of, I would claim that there is some kind of causal impact and not just association with these shock variables, as well as with the instruments. We are able to pick up some kind of identification, although obviously not perfectly. And I've also done some work on using the European Social Survey to get more at the individual level. And you see very similar trends with trade having a big impact, as well as technology. So what is the issue here? Why should we be worried about the far right? And I think the issue is that a lot of populist parties, especially on the far right, are kind of interested in a different type of democracy than a lot of liberal democracies we have now. So many of the liberal democracies have representative systems where they have constraints on the executive. That is, they have very strong parliaments that can constrain the executive. They have independent institutions like central banks and other commissions. They have strong courts, judicial systems, and rule of law. And all of these things can act as constraints on the executive, as well as freedom of the press. A lot of this, the populist parties are opposed to these kind of constraints. They prefer strict majority rule that's not constrained by the rights of minorities through courts and legislatures. They like referenda where the people can vote directly. And the question is whether these kinds of things, these, in a sense, less liberal democracies tend to veer off into autocracy as leaders eliminate political competition through these other means and through the evisceration of this kind of representative democracy. So what is necessary for democracy, and how can it be undermined? And the key for for democracy is political equality. Everybody's vote is supposed to count the same. And it's really important that you kind of have this sense that there is fairness and individual kind of equality. You need free and fair elections, competition between programmatic parties and not just parties that are, giving out goodies. Clientelist parties seems to be important. Some sense of legitimacy and public support tend to be important, as well as these liberal institutions of constitutions and rule of law and independent courts, free press, powerful legislatures, as well as these various freedoms, individual freedoms that protect minorities in particular from majority rule, because we don't often want majorities to be crushed by them. So how do globalization and democracy interact, and should be worried that there are parts of globalization that might undermine these essential qualities of democracy? And the question I think really is does global capitalism lead to more economic inequality? Does it lead to more individual insecurity? And does it lead to increased levels of interdependence such that it undermines, in a sense, national democracy and the sense of fairness of national democracy? And so I want to look at three particular questions. And the first is really, does economic inequality undermine political equality necessary for democracy? Does economic insecurity generate discontent with democracy? And does rising global interdependence generate a democratic deficit at the domestic level that undermines support for democracy? So on this first question, the worry really is that economic inequality, that if you have 10% or less, or 1% of the population owning 50% of income and assets, is that really compatible with political equality? And history shows that democracy tends to fail when inequality becomes very high. So there's really a worry that since the 1980s, inequality, especially in the United States and the UK, has been rising, but it's been rising in all sorts of countries, and in all sorts of countries in Western Europe as well. As a side note, we think COVID is making all of this worse, so that's going to be something to deal with in the future. But the question is really, is rising, we worry, is rising inequality due to globalization? We think it's due to some part of that, but we also think it's due to technological change. But if the two of globalization and technological change are associated, then it's probably kind of bundled up together, and people see globalization as leading to greater inequality. And the worry is, right, that if you have this 1% of the population that's so wealthy, and they're seen as the prime beneficiaries from globalization and openness, and they're seen as having special access to political leaders and to parties, and as driving political programs, and as people's votes not really counting because these special interest groups and this top 1% basically are able to drive policy. You get an erosion of support for democracy, an erosion of support for current elites and for political parties. And it's very worrisome for democracy that this inequality generates this sense of unfairness in the system. The second element is really the question of economic insecurity. And do high levels of insecurity drive distaste for democracy? And we know that, capitalism generates creative destruction. This is one of the great things about capitalism. We see it destroying occupations, entire occupations, destroying firms, destroying industries, but creating others, obviously. The global technological revolutions create all sorts of turmoil in the system. We now see, offshoring and replacement of people by robots. And worries about market volatility through these global financial crises and things. In the 1950s to about the 1990s, we thought that the welfare state could cushion a lot of this. But in the wake of the financial crisis, governments chose austerity instead of increasing the welfare state. We're seeing a slightly different response now as a lesson learned, perhaps, from the global financial crisis. But that austerity seems to drive a lot of insecurity and anxiety about what's going on. And populist programs, as I said before, tend to feed off of this and to create, senses of, we're going to protect you, we're going to create we're going to protect the nation, and we're going to close things off and create and reduce this anxiety and this insecurity. And it's worrisome that this drives support from the far right in some sense. Finally, we think that globalization increases the need for global governance. The recent tax treaty that we're seeing at the global level is one big indicator of this, that for 20 or 30 years, we've let corporate tax rates especially, be eroded and sort of race to the bottom. And there's this sense that, this is really hurting, and that we need global governance, and we need a sense of international cooperation to deal with this. But again, this international cooperation, especially in the case of the EU, has generated a sense that there's a democratic deficit, that Brussels is making all of these decisions. It's very far from, your local representative. And we think a lot of this drove the sense of distaste for what's happening at the international level, and to Brexit as kind of a reaction against this dissatisfaction with austerity, with the global financial crisis, so with globalization, and with the kind of European response to it. Let me, in a sense, conclude and just say that I think that in terms of global capitalism, there are three elements that seem to be very important. Trade being one of them, finance being a second, and technology being a third. I know in Europe you've focused a lot on immigration, but that was in part due to the 2015-16 surges that we got off of the Syrian conflict. And immigration is a problem in the United States as well as in Europe, but the levels of it don't seem to be the drivers that say trade and technology and technological change are. And trade does seem to be driving this support for the extreme right. Technological change and concerns over it and anxiety about it seem to be driving some of the distaste with the left. And then global financial markets and this kind of financialization of the economy and of politics, again, seem to be spurring support for the extreme right. A lot of my other work that I didn't show here suggests that the social welfare policy hasn't had the moderating effect that we thought it might have. That may be because social welfare spending hasn't been augmented in the face of rapidly rising globalization in the last 2 decades. So maybe we need more of it, or maybe it's not working, or maybe we need changes in it. But I think, as Lucia was saying at the beginning, in terms of thinking about policy choices, I think questions about how to deal with, social welfare spending, job turmoil, and job training, and things like this are really critical for the EU as well as national governments. And the whole question of inequality and addressing inequality is very critical as well, and what to do about it. Lastly, the coronavirus and its impact. As I say, I think we're seeing rising inequality because of it. and there's great worry about how it's affecting job markets. We're seeing these very strange kind of recoveries in the United States, and jobs are going to disappear and jobs are going to change. And again, the policy response to this is very, very important. The big worry is globalization and democracy going to end badly, as in this interwar period, and obviously. Global warfare would be very different these days with nuclear weapons and cyber war. So I think perhaps we will avoid that, but will we avoid the damage to liberal democracy that it suffered during this period? And I think that, again, in terms of political responses, we really need to think about liberal democracy and what to do about it and how to maintain support for it. So I thank you for your attention and look forward to any comments or questions you have. I'm working on a book for this right now about all of this. So any input is really appreciated. Thank you very much for listening.